Welcome to session 5 of the Middle High German lecture series, Phonology and Graphemics.
Writing and sound. Natural languages are primarily spoken languages. Various languages are attested that have no writing system. Since the invention of the phonograph, these can even be documented. Children also acquire spoken language before they come into contact with written culture. Even for so-called altverschriftete Sprachen, languages with an original writing system of their own, we have evidence of their existence before the invention of writing. For example, through the Platonic myth about the invention of the alphabet by the god Thoth. The inventors of writing systems employed different strategies when transcribing various languages. Writing typology distinguishes three methods, in the order of when they first occurred throughout history. Firstly, logographies, secondly, syllabaries, and thirdly, alphabets. The basic principle of logography, which is what the writing of central layers of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs or Chinese are based on, for example, is that characters, so-called logograms, correspond to units of meaning. The basic principle of syllabaries, with which various Native American languages and central parts of Korean and Japanese are written, is the correspondence of characters to speech syllables. Finally, the basic principle of alphabetic writing is the correspondence of characters and sounds, graphemes and phonemes. In a nutshell, the central question of writing typology is whether the basic units of writing systems correspond to meaningful units with words, or to phonological units such as syllables or sounds. It is important to note that specific writing systems are never purely logographic, syllabic, or phonemic. The reasons for this are functional as well as historical. Functionally, the disadvantage of logographic systems is that the number of characters would tend towards infinity if the principle of semantic correspondence were consistently maintained. Strictly alphabetic systems, on the other hand, have the disadvantage that they also record irrelevant fluctuations in the chain of sounds, and thus create problems for intelligibility where none exist in spoken language. A very obvious example of this kind of overexpression, which to our knowledge has affected all alphabetically written languages since the High Middle Ages, is the functionalization of the spatium, the space, as a word separator. The spatium represents a deviation from the basal phonetic correspondence of alphabet scripts, insofar as it divides a continuous chaîne parlée into discontinuous units. We shall briefly return to the implementation of the spatium as a word separator in the medieval vernaculars of Europe, and especially in German. Historically, the relative hybridity of writing systems can be best explained by the fact that very few written languages are so-called altverschriftete Sprachen. More specifically, these are languages for which a specific writing system was developed, and, in the case of alphabet scripts, tailored to the specifics of its phonological system. Greek and Latin are languages that have had a significant impact on European cultural history, even if they are not altverschriftete Sprachen in the narrowest sense. The medieval European vernaculars, on the other hand, are typical examples of how writing systems were borrowed. There certainly would have been alternatives for writing the Old Germanic languages, such as by using the runic alphabet, traces of which can actually still be found in the Old English and Old Scandinavian writing systems. For the recording of the Gothic Bible in the 4th century, Bishop Wulfila developed his own alphabet, based mainly on Greek. The fact that the literarization of the European vernaculars took place via the Christian mission led to the Latin alphabet being used to record vernaculars under the influence of the Latin-speaking Western Church. As a rule, it seems to have worked surprisingly well, considering that the phonology of Latin and Germanic languages, such as German, differs significantly. Occasionally, however, the difficulties became so great that complaints about them were handed down to posterity. In one case, such a complaint has actually survived. It is found in the context of a dedicatory letter written around 863 to Bishop Luitbert of Mainz, in which Ottfried von Weissenburg lists a number of cases in which the letters of the Latin alphabet are inadequate for recording vernacular sounds. Dominance and limits of phonography in Middle High German. In order to be able to describe the historical development of the German writing system more precisely, a descriptive linguistic model is required. The model of transcriptive and orthographic principles, which we'll come to next, is based on the bilateral model of the linguistic sign, as can be found in the structuralism of Dosseur's influence. This concept states that the linguistic signs unite a mental concept and a physical form, a signified, signifié, and a signifier, signifiant. In principle, signified and signifier are in a reciprocal relationship. A mental concept corresponds to a physical form, and vice versa. The concept and form can nevertheless be analytically separated. The semantic level contains only the conceptual side of the linguistic sign. The phonological and graphemic levels, only the physical side. be it phonetic or written. All other grammatical levels refer to the linguistic sign as unit of meaning and physical form. The morphological level relates to morphemes and their means of expression, the lexical level to words and their means of expression, the syntax level to sentences and their means of expression, and the textual level to texts and their means of expression. These means of expression can be phonic or graphic. In the context of the historical graphemics of German, we're primarily interested in the graphic means of expression. The graphic means of expression of an alphabetically written language can be classified according to whether they only establish relationships between the phonological and the graphic level, or whether they also establish relationships between the semantic and the graphic level. In the first case, one can speak of spellings based upon the phonological principle. The basic phonological principle is established via three individual principles. The phonomatic principle, which establishes the grapheme and phoneme correspondence, the syllabic principle, and the intonatory principle. The semantic principle is complementary to the phonological principle. The basic semantic principle is concretely established via four individual principles in turn, namely the morphomatic principle, the lexical principle, the syntactic principle, and the textual principle. From a functional point of view, the interplay of phonographic and semantic principles corresponds to the distinction between shallow and deep alphabet systems. The shallower an alphabet is, the less it deviates from the rendering of the chaîne parlée, and the more it suits the interests of the writer. The deeper an alphabet is, the more morphological, lexical, and syntactic information its rules encode, and the more it meets the interests of the reader. Before we apply this principle model to the history of German spelling, by one chosen example at least, it should be remembered that alphabetic spelling systems cannot help but privilege the phonomatic principle, since their basic principle, as mentioned, is the assignment of letters to sounds. Strictly phonographic spelling should actually attempt to reproduce the continuous character of the chaîne parlée in as unadulterated a fashion as possible. In fact, early alphabets made a very extensive effort to do so. If one looks at ancient text sources, even a non-linguistic observer immediately notices that their layout differs from what we are used to in present-day texts in a very important way. On the bronze plate shown, probably written around the year 500 BC in Elis in Greece, the letters are lined up next to each other without any further way of identifying semantic units, such as words. This principle of scriptura continua changed little until the early Middle Ages. The excerpt shown here from a Virgil manuscript from around 500 AD has punctuation marks, namely superscript dots, but no word separation. The implementation of the regular marking of word boundaries by a regular space, the so-called spatium, takes place in Europe over the course of a lengthy process that extends from the 7th to 12th centuries, and even then does not appear to become fully consolidated. We will explain this briefly using an early Middle High German source. In the second half of the 12th century, vernacular rubrics and prayer instructions were recorded in a series of Latin breviaries, which originate from the Syncope monastery and are now kept in the Graz University Library. Although the spatium is principally established as a word separator, there are also features characteristic of orality, such as syncopes, apocopes, and clitics. An uncertainty in the separation of personal pronouns in unstressed position is particularly striking. The selected text excerpt has
Solm
instead of
soll man,
and
soll's
instead of,
soll sie,
and in one case even
soll's
instead of.
soll man sie.
On the one hand, this tendency towards phonetic spelling is possibly due to the pragmatic nature of the text. The source contains Latin liturgical formulas and vernacular references to their use in worship. As such, one can readily assume an oral dialogue situation lay behind its origins. On the other hand, the proximity to orality fits a small-scale range of Middle High German Schreibsprachen, which is also possible to evidence here. The enclisis of pronominal man to occurs in Middle High German, mainly in Alemannic sources. From a functional point of view, this is unproblematic as long as the cognitive range of the source remains fairly limited. Conversely, under the conditions of Middle High German writing, it's very unlikely that the Syncope breviaries will be adopted in regions where spelling such as
Solm, soll's, and solms
have no phonetic correlate and are therefore not understandable. In this respect, the vernacular passages of the Syncope breviaries are a good example for the thesis that the Schreibsprachen of Middle High German are dominated by the phonomatic writing principle. The typologically mixed character of contemporary German orthography is mainly due to the emergence of morphomatic spelling in early High German. Phonology. Now that we have clarified some fundamental methodological questions about the relationship between sound and writing in the corpus language that is Middle High German, we can now turn to its phonology. We lack the time here for a systematic and exhaustive presentation of the Middle High German phonological system. Instead, we'll proceed selectively, and, in the spirit of our approach of focusing on linguistic variation, concentrate on those areas that are characteristic of the temporal and spatial structure of the Middle High German Schreibsprachen. Finally, we'll take a brief look at contemporary meta-linguistic evidence that take the phonetic perspective into account. Vowels. So let's start with developments in the vowel system. Here, developments in the area of the root syllable are to be distinguished from developments of unstressed syllables. We'll start with the latter. Weakening of unstressed syllables. Unstressed syllables are syllables outside of the main accent in the stem syllable, regardless of whether they occur in derivational affixes or in inflectional endings. While in Old High German, all long and short vowels still occur in unstressed syllables, these vowels are weakened to a schwa sound in the transition to Middle High German. The process can be represented schematically, as follows. It turns out that the weakening of unstressed syllables, like all language change phenomena, did not occur suddenly, but gradually. It is now assumed that the weakening of unstressed syllables began as early as the 9th century in Old High German. It generally became an established change in the 11th and 12th centuries, but also appeared occasionally in the early New High German period. For the sake of clarity, we will refrain from special regional developments that lead to the weakening of unstressed syllables, being either partially reversed, or at least leading to different results rather than schwa. The main reason for the weakening that affected unstressed syllables since the Old High German period is the assignment of the word stress to the root syllable in Germanic. The fixed accent on the root syllable, i.e. the initial stress of Germanic, and the fact that the following syllables are unstressed, is what leads to their gradual weakening. What we are dealing with here is a consequence of the principle of language economy. All articulatory energy flows into the root syllable, while the peripheral, unstressed syllables are weakened. Even if one ignores some regional linguistic developments, it should be pointed out that the weakening of unstressed syllables does not affect all unstressed vowels in the same way. For example, the suffix e in Old High German
Gesti,
is weakened to become schwa in Middle High German,
Gäste,
while the unstressed I in Old High German
Freundin,
remains in both Middle High German
Freundinnen,
and New High German.
Freunde.
As a rule of thumb, it can be stated that the full vowels of the Old High German unstressed syllables are retained if they have a stronger secondary stress compared to the weakened unstressed syllable vowels. This is usually the case when the meaning of these syllables has not faded. This applies, for example, to certain derivational suffixes that are still productive in Middle High German, such as
Unge, Nisse, Inne, Lien, Lich, or Er.
Conversely, the process of weakening primarily affects vowels in 3 positions. It occurs largely without exception in unstressed prefixes. The Old High German prefixes
Ga and Gi,
collapse to Middle High German.
Ge.
The Old High German prefixes
Ar and Ir,
collapse to Middle High German.
Er.
And the Old High German prefixes
Fo and Fir,
collapse to Middle High German.
Fer, etc.
Additionally, the weakening of unstressed syllables works without much restriction in derivational suffix that are very old and no longer productive. As such, Old High German
Ag, Id, Ida,
appear as
Ek, El, and Ade.
in Middle High German. Finally, the weakening of unstressed syllables also affects inflectional endings, and this will have consequences for the further development of German phonology, morphology, and syntax. The grammatical morphemes in Middle High German only contain schwa. Only the pronominal and adjective endings in the nominative singular, the feminine, and in the nominative accusative plural of the neuter remain as
U,
apocope and syncope. In certain positions, the unstressed vowels of Middle High German are not only weakened, but completely eliminated. We can distinguish here between apocope and syncope. Apocope concerns the loss of an unstressed e at the end of the word, syncope the loss of the unstressed e word internally. Apocope occurs mainly in 2 situations. Firstly, after a short root syllable ending in a liquid, so L or R. For example,
Old High German spille, Middle High German spill. Old High German ich fahru, Middle High German ich fahr.
the alternative situation is after a liquid or nasal in the syllable coda.
Old High German großer, Middle High German größer. Old High German wagane, Middle High German wagan.
Syncope occurs mainly in three situations. The first is after a short root syllable ending in a liquid, so again, L or R.
Old High German spilles, Middle High German spilts. Old High German faran, Middle High German farn.
Secondly, in tri and polysyllabics with a long root syllable, and especially after liquid or nasal.
Old High German gibardida, Middle High German giberde.
And thirdly, with the prefix ge, or Old High German ge, before a vowel and before R, L, N, or W.
Old High German gleich, Middle High German gleich or gleich. Old High German gnada, Middle High German gnade, gnade.
This also rarely happens with be, Old High German be.
Old High German belieben, Middle High German belieben or belieben.
Stating that apocope and syncope occur primarily in a particular context requires some explanation. Firstly, the list we've just mentioned describe the situation that we encounter in a few manuscripts of classical Middle High German from the first half of the 13th century. The text editions then use these as a basis for their treatment of syncope and apocope. For historical linguistics, this again results in the methodological difficulties that we have discussed several times. However, the typical contexts where syncope and apocope occur are not entirely plucked out of thin air. These seemingly occur mainly after root syllables of low phonetic weight. Within the vowel system, short vowels have little phonetic weight, and in the consonant system this applies to liquids. In addition, the phonetic weight of a root is also measured by the number of syllables from which it is composed. Monosyllabic roots have the lightest phonetic weight. If syncope and apocope occur prototypically after monosyllabic short vowel roots ending in liquids, this is plausible insofar as a maximally clear hierarchy between root and unstressed syllables must be maintained in prototypical German words. This also results of initial accent and weakening of unstressed syllables. If the root has too little weight, it runs the risk of no longer being structurally distinguishable from an unstressed syllable. As a result, the suffix is reduced or lost altogether. That being said, this functionalist view contains only half the truth. Like many historical sound changes, syncope and apocope spread unevenly in time and space. The Finnish Germanist Kai Lindgren showed as early as 1953 that apocope began in Bavarian in the second half of the 13th century, before spreading relatively linearly into Swabian and East Franconian in the 14th century, and, after a bit of time, also into Upper Alemannic and Bohemian, before it could be detected in texts from the Rhineland and Middle Franconia in the 16th century, so 250 years after its first appearance. This chronology has sometimes been called into question because of some of Lindgren's methodological weaknesses, but a convincing alternative proposal is still missing. Lindgren was also able to show that the apocope does in fact first appear after monosyllabic short vowel roots ending in a liquid, but that as it becomes more widespread, it becomes clear that almost every final unstressed E can become subject to apocope. Even in present-day German, the final unstressed E regularly becomes a victim of redevelopment. This happens both in the phonemic system as well as on physical public buildings. On signs with the inscription
Aufzug im Brandfalle or im Brandfall nicht benutzen.
Do not use the elevator in case of fire. The data form usually appears without the suffix E after a renovation has taken place. According to the standards of classical Middle High German, this is a highly overdue apocope, since we are dealing with a monosyllabic short vowel root ending in a liquid. So now to the unstressed vowels, where we'll limit ourselves to a few key developments. I umlaut. Most handbooks and language histories declare the expansion of umlaut as the most important phonological innovation of Middle High German compared to Old High German. In phonology, umlaut is understood as a partial assimilation, so a partial adjustment of the vowel of the main syllable to the vowel of the following less stressed syllable. From a universal phonological point of view, this is a kind of vowel harmony. In the Germanic languages apart from Gothic, there was assimilation between a stressed vowel and the following I, or its positionally related variant, J, which is why the umlaut processes are decisive for the development of German, and their results are referred to as I umlaut. In Old High German, I or J in an unstressed syllable cause a palatalization of all back vowels, so that's long and short A, O, and U, and their combinations. and in the case of short a, an additional raising to high eh sound. This high eh sound was obviously understood by the scribes of Old High German as an allophone, so a phonetic variant of the phoneme e before I, and correspondingly written with the letter e, as in the case of
Gast, a, gesti, I.
If there was another unstressed syllable between the short a in the stressed syllable and the following I or j, or if there was a two prominent consonant combination, such as ht, s, hr, etc., only palatalization took place and no raising. The umlaut of u, o, and their combinations results in palatalization without raising. In all these cases, the palatalization products were interpreted by the scribes of Old High German as allophones of their original sounds, and written accordingly.
Macht, machti, with a, laufan, laufet, ou.
What does change in relation to Middle High German is the status of these latter palatalization products on the one hand, and their spelling on the other. In Old High German, the palatalized allophones of u, o, and a and their combinations did not have to be marked graphically, because the umlaut causing I which followed, because the I which caused the umlaut followed. This changes in Middle High German, as the weakening of unstressed vowels leads to the disappearance of the conditioning factors of the palatalized allophones. As a result, the palatal umlauts are reinterpreted as phonemes and written accordingly. When it comes to terminology, the written palatalization and raising of short a in Old High German is referred to as primary umlaut, and the palatalization of a, o, and u in their combinations as secondary umlaut. Monophthongization and diphthongization. According to most handbooks, the development of the Middle High German long vowels
I, u,
into the diphthongs
I, oi, au.
and the complementary reduction of the Middle High German diphthongs
Ie, uo, ue.
to the long vowels
I, u.
is an important intralinguistic criterion of distinguishing Middle High German from early New High German. However, as we saw in the last session, from a variation point of view, both sound changes provide criteria for the spatial and temporal differentiation of the Middle High German Schreibsprachen. The diphthongization of
I, u.
first appeared in the 12th century in Styria, in the south of Upper Germany, and spread to central Bavaria in the 13th century, before reaching central Germany as early as 1350, at the official end of the late Middle High German period. The development of the Middle High German diphthongs
Ie, uo, ue.
is similar. Their monophthongization to
I, u.
is limited to Central German, in the west of which the process first appeared in the 11th and in the 12th centuries. So in the 11th century,
Uo, ue became uu, and in the 12th, ie, I.
however, the interpretation of the manuscript evidence is more difficult here than with diphthongization. For instance, the letter U with superscribed O can denote both the old diphthong and the new monophthong in many sources. Consonants. The second consonant shift. Although this change took place between the 5th and 7th centuries, the development of the Germanic plosives and fricatives in the so-called second consonant shift remains an important criterion for the geographical differentiation of the Middle High German Schreibsprachen from a variation-based point of view. 3 consonant triples are affected. The voices Germanic plosives P, T, and K, the so-called tenues, which are shifted to High German double fricatives in post-vocalic position, and to affricates in the non-post-vocalic position. So initially, when they're geminate, or post-consonantally. The next triple affected are the voiced Germanic fricatives and plosives, the so-called median, which in High German either remain voiced or become voiceless. And the third triple, the voices Germanic fricatives, which remain unchanged except for the dental, which becomes a voiced plosive in High German. In the following section, we will concentrate on the development of the voiceless plosives. They shifted gradually from north to south, and thus provide an easy-to-use criterion for localizing High German language material. We will look at the individual shift stages from north to south, and use the dialect boundaries as a guide. Firstly, the Benrath line. South of the Low and High German border, there is a shift from post-vocalic
p, t, k to z.
This happens after a long vowel or diphthong. The double fricatives are simplified to z, and the shift of t to the affricate in initial position when geminate and in post-consonantal position. The second line is the Eifelschranke, or the Dorf line. South of the riparian or Mosel-Franconian border, the shift from p to f takes place in a post-liquid position. Thirdly, the Hunsrückschranke, which is the dat or das line. As an exception from the rule outlined above, post-vocalic
t
in small but highly frequent words such as
dat, what, it.
is not shifted at the Benrath line, but further south in Rhine-Franconian. Fourthly, the Punt-Fund line. East of the West Central German and East Central German border, the shift of
p to f
takes place. Fifthly, the Speyer line. South of the border between Central and Upper German, there is a shift from
p to
in the non-post-vocalic positions, so initially, when geminate, and post-nasally. Sixth is the Kint-Chint line. South of the South Upper German border, the shift from
k to k.
occurs in the initial position, when geminate and in post-consonantal position. We wish to demonstrate using a short piece of text how to localise Middle High German sources based on the successive shifting of the tenues.
t, k.
The following passage comes from a 13th century manuscript at Hanover State Library. Let's go through the relevant evidence in turn. Incidentally, as a native English speaker, you have an advantage by being able to recognise unshifted variants in many cases.
Hilp mir, Frauwe, dat ich et volle brenge. Widde min Herze it is so enge, wat mach bas din gulden Kleid zien, wann dina Minden oversche schien.
So hilp in line 4345. As in English, help, Germanic P is preserved in post-liquid position. We are therefore north of the Dorf line, or Eifelschranke, so Ripuarian or Low German.
Dat, it, wat.
As in English, that, it, what, Germanic T is preserved in post-vocalic position north of the das line, or Hunsrückschranke. The unshifted forms appear in Mosel-Franconian, in Ripuarian, or in Low German.
Herze.
Unlike in English, heart, the Germanic T is shifted in post-consonantal position to the affricate. This is the case south of the Benrath line, so we're in High German, not Low German.
Bas.
Unlike in English, better, Germanic T in the post-vocalic position is shifted to the double fricative, which appears simplified here in final position. This form can also occur throughout High German. If we match these findings with a specific evidence,
Herze and Bas
clearly point to the area south of the Benrath line, to High German. The evidence from
dat, it, wat.
further narrows down our conclusion. They only occur in the extreme northwest of High German, north of the dat-das line, in Mosel-Franconian or Ripuarian. Thanks to
Hilp,
we can narrow our finding down even more precisely to Ripuarian. In Mosel-Franconian, the form should be
Hilf.
The source can therefore be determined as Ripuarian, which is also reflected in the title of the text that it transmits. It is the only textual witness of the Rheinische Marienlob. Final devoicing. Final devoicing, the last development that we will deal with for Middle High German consonants, is often presented too simply in handbooks. It is usually stated that in final position, the Old High German voice plosives
B, d, g.
appear in Middle High German as voiceless plosives,
P, t, k.
and that in the same position, the Old High German voiceless labial fricative
V,
appears in Middle High German as a voiceless labial plosive. This neutralization of voice in final position also occurs in the modern New High German standard language. It is uncontroversial that Old High German has voiced and unvoiced consonants in final position, and that this opposition becomes neutralized in New High German. However, the idea that this development occurs linearly in Middle High German needs revision. The first objection concerns chronology. As early as 1977, the American Germanist George Vaught was able to show that dating final devoicing to Middle High German is not tenable against the backdrop of surviving written records. Let us focus our attention on Vaught's results from the spelling of the final dental. Even in one of the earliest and graphically most elaborate textual witnesses of Old High German, the anonymous Isidore translation from the late 8th century, pairs of dental spellings appear that can only be interpreted as indications of final devoicing. In
Keyboard, Kubordi,
the fortis letter T at the end of the word corresponds to the lanus letter D in the middle of the word. As Vaught was able to show, comparable graphemic relationships can be found throughout the entire Old High German period, regardless of the dialectal origin of the text and the quality of the writing systems. Final devoicing occurs both in Central German and in Upper German, as well as in extravagant codices such as the Vienna Ottfried manuscript, and even in the fringes of written culture, such as in the Strasburger Blutsegen. One would do well to say that final devoicing is an Old High German rather than Middle High German phonological phenomenon. Of course, that is not to say that final devoicing does not also occur in Middle High German. There is ample evidence of this in the manuscripts. But there is also substantial evidence for an opposing change that began in the 12th century. This is called consonant weakening, and this represents a limitation to the standard theory. During Middle and Early New High German, large parts of both High and Low German were subject to waves of consonant weakening, the most important of which you can see on the map. These are the Central Bavarian consonant weakening, the Inner German consonant weakening, also known as
Binnendeutsche Konsonantenschwächung,
and the Low German consonant weakening. In particular, the weakening of consonants in Central Bavaria and Germany led to some places of an Old Middle High German becoming voiceless due to final devoicing, and in some cases to fricatives becoming voiced again. According to the evidence from written records, this opposing change seems to have affected labials and velars in particular, and dentals to a much lesser extent. This limitation permits us to refine our interpretation of the standard theory. It is safe to say that Middle High German final devoicing actually no longer applied in large parts of Middle High German. The answer to the question of how devoicing ended up in normalised Middle High German and in text editions is surprisingly simple. The fathers of normalised Middle High German based their views of final devoicing on the standard sound of the 19th century. This was shaped by North German pronunciation conventions in which consonant weakening had left no traces. In Central and Southern German dialects, on the other hand, final devoicing only applies to a limited extent, even in present-day pronunciation. We'll now look at two meta-linguistic testimonies. An encyclopedic poem called Renner, written around 1300 by Hugo von Tremberg, there is a longer meta-linguistic excursus, the first section of which is dedicated to the 5 vowels, in the tradition of the Latin school grammar of Donato Priscian. The excursus concludes with reflections on the holy languages of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. In between, there is a much-cited passage on the diatopic structure of German.
Swabe ihr Wörter spaltend, die Franken ein Teil sie faltend, die Baire sie zerrend, die Dyrie sie aufsperrend, die Sachsen sie bezuckend, die Rhinlüd sie verdruckend, die Wettereiber sie würgend, die Miesner sie wohl schürgend, Eggerland sie swanket, Osterreich sie schränket, Stierlas sie basslenkend, Kern dein Teil sie senkend. Die Landsprach davor genannt, in Tütschen Landen sind bekannt.
The first thing that needs to be explained is the precise meaning of the term Landsprache. While older researchers equated Hugo's term with the modern notion of dialects, Reifenstein has pointed out that in medieval and early modern sources, the term is used exclusively to mean vernacular. This clarification is important because the concept of a dialect requires the demarcation from a supra-regional standard, which, as you'll recall, does not exist for Middle High German. The passage belongs in a session on the phonology of Middle High German, because Hugo characterizes the individual Landsprache using phonetic properties. Gustav Ehresmann, the most prominent expert on the source to date, commented on these characterizations by saying, "For our understanding of the phonetics of the medieval dialects, these characterizations could be of the greatest value, if only they were not so obscure." Hugo's formulations are really unclear because there was no German linguistic terminology available to him around the year 1300. His choice of words is not impressionistic either. On the contrary, there is some evidence that Hugo is not trying to provide the most precise phonetic description possible. That would only be possible for individual sounds, not for entire varieties. Rather, Ehresmann has shown in his meticulous philological work that Hugo's mode of expression is based on the ancient rhetorical tradition, namely on Cicero's De Oratore, and, primarily, on Alcuin's De Rhetorica et Virtutibus, which in turn was strongly influenced by Cicero. Let's have a look at Alcuin's thoughts on pronunciation.
Vitia quoque si quaesunt oris diligenti cura sunt emendanda, nec verba sind inflate vel anhelata, vel in faucibus fredentia, nec oris inanitate resonantia, non aspera fredentibus dentibus, non hiantibus labris prolata, sed pressem et equibalita et lenita et clare pronunciata.
According to Lähnemann, Hugo applied points from Alcuin's checklist to the various Landparker, according to criteria that we can no longer understand.
In faucibus fredantia
Corresponds to
würgend, prolata
corresponds to
schürgend, pressem pronunciata
corresponds to.
spaltend or zerrend.
Lähnemann thinks this refers to a kind of staccato articulation.
Equabilita pronunciata
Corresponds to.
faltend or aufsperret.
And what is probably meant here is legato articulation. Finally,
Lenita et clare pronunciata
would mean the opposite of what Hugo describes as
bezucken or verdrucken.
the process of using terms from the Latin rhetorical tradition for global phonetic characterization of regional Middle High German varieties or their speakers we found not just in Hugo, but also in contemporary Latin language sources. The Memoriale de
Prerogativa Imperii Romani.
Thank you very much. Written in 1281 by the Cologne scholar Alexander of Rose, draws on the opposition of grossus, meaning thick, versus mitis, fine, to differentiate between the Main-Franconian and the Rhine-Franconian varieties of Middle High German.
Et isti Franci orientalis cum Francis Germanis in idiomate teutonico concordant, licet illi grossiori et isti monomitori pronuncient.
The precise phonetic opposition that is meant here remains unclear, but is of secondary importance for our observations. Our attention should be focused on the fact that Alexander, like Hugo von Trinberg, uses an older rhetorical terminology tradition. The use of Latin grossus to characterize the human voice is not found in ancient classical works. Instead, it was used a generation before Alexander by Albertus Magnus, who used the expression in an analogy of how strings work.
Ita est in instrumentis musicis, quod grossa corda grossiorem sonum facit et gracilis graciliorem.
The lecture from which the passage comes was probably given around 1258 in Cologne. Alexander of Rose, who has been shown to be a canon in the Cologne monastery of St. Maria in the capital around the middle of the 13th century, would have had the opportunity to follow Albertus' lectures, or to learn about them in some other way. However, it's not possible to reconstruct whether he made the most of this opportunity.